Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we have our world famous speaker Professor Edward and Professor Rob. We will discuss on artificial general intelligence, which is very important. You know that we are launching programs in Malaysia and South Asia about AI integration in business. First I would like to give chance Professor Edward.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and I'm sad to say I'm not going to be able to be here too long because I have another thing coming up. But and Rob, I'm sure, will say many fascinating and intelligent things as he always does. Anyway, but I wanted to make a couple of points. First of all, for your audience, I want to make the distinction between artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a system, an algorithm that basically gathers information and tries to solve certain defined problems or have a certain defined consequence or output. This can be anything from, for example, whenever you order something on Amazon, it knows what your orders are, it knows what you like and don't like, and so it will present you with advertisements. The AI will present you with advertisements saying, hey, you might like this or that or the other. That's a very small form of artificial intelligence. Some of the most interesting forms of artificial intelligence deal with deep learning and systems that can actually understand and come up with new discoveries. Now, most of us know about the artificial intelligence computers that were able to beat masters at chess, or the Asian a game called Go. But in a lot of those cases, the programmers say, here are what the rules are of chess, for example, and now the artificial intelligence will play a game of chess and win the game of chess. But you have artificial intelligence now that can simply look at a game being played and then figure out what the rules are and then play the game and win. One example that I just wrote something about last week is a artificial intelligence program was developed by medical researchers. And what they did was they had the program review approximately 10,000 functional MRI brain scans, looking especially at blood flow in the brain. So the AI basically reviewed all of these scans so they could kind of understand what the technology was, what was happening in the brain. Then they had the artificial intelligence review about 1,000 brain scans of people who had Alzheimer's or schizophrenia or autism. And the AI was able to determine what patterns in seemingly healthy brains indicate that years later that brain might be afflicted by Alzheimer's or some of these other diseases. In other words, the artificial intelligence learned on its own and was able to make discoveries. And this, by the way, it will be a very, very important breakthrough for replacing our sick care system with a healthcare system. So we have all of these specific things that artificial intelligence can do. But what is artificial general intelligence? Well, we know that artificial intelligence can do some things very, very well, crunch numbers and so forth. But there's a lot of things that we humans can do far better than artificial intelligence. An artificial general intelligence wouldn't be just to discover something in MRIs to make medical discoveries or to play chess or something like that. It would literally be a general intelligence that can pretty much do anything that a human brain can do. So it wouldn't be focused. Now, to create one of these things, of course, is very difficult, and we don't know how to do it yet. I've seen three different ways that possibly could bring about an artificial general intelligence. One is keep building the regular artificial intelligence, and at some point it'll reach a takeoff point, so to speak, where mind will emerge from all of these modules, you might say. That's one approach to creating an artificial general intelligence. A second approach is what's called whole brain emulation. And this is where the brain is scanned and you try to reproduce, usually in silicon, every little thing that happens in a human brain. And the idea is that if you can do it if you could take everything that's going on in the human brain and do it maybe in a computer, a mind will emerge. It will be a general intelligence and not just a focused intelligence. Of course, there's a lot of challenges with that. The human brain has 85 billion neurons. That's a lot. Each neuron has something like 1,000 connections, and signals are going back and forth at 200 signals a second. That's just a ton of information in one brain. Okay. And you'd have to have not only a computing capacity that could do all of that, but you'd have to have scanning of the brain that could get down to the pico level, to such a small level, to figure out what's going on and to emulate it. So this is another approach to creating an artificial general intelligence, but again, it's probably pretty far off in the future. Another thing would be a breakthrough to come up with a comprehensive theory of mind, because right now the mind is the most mysterious thing we have. It's what we're using right now. And coming up with a general theory of mind, a really comprehensive theory of mind, might help us figure out how to create an artificial general intelligence. But here's another way to think about it. For centuries, for millennia, human beings have imagined flying. Every human being from when humans emerged looked at the birds and said, wow, wouldn't it be cool to fly? And the thinking was always, well, we just have to figure out how to create wings, and that's what we'll do. There are, famous sketches, the Greek myths, of Icarus putting wax wings on and flying too close to the sun, and wax wings melts and he flies into the ocean, falls into the ocean. The idea that others have come up with, and the Renaissance, well, if you just have the right wings, you can do this. Early attempts to fly, actually in the 19th century, you could see people coming up with these wings and trying to do this kind of thing. And they figured that's how we're going to fly. Okay. But how did we end up flying? We ended up flying in a very different way, with an airplane, which was a very different mechanic, right? I was just on an airplane recently, and you have this thing that's many tons. It's huge. It weighs more than buildings, and somehow it lifts off into the air. Our ancestors would be astonished by this. Why do I make the analogy with flying? Because it might be that artificial general intelligence emerges in some way that we can't imagine, just as earlier people couldn't imagine, well, how do you fly if you don't have wings? Well, you create this thing called an airplane. It's very complex. So it might well be that an artificial general intelligence is going to emerge in a very different way. But here's the final interesting thing. Remember, an artificial and general intelligence isn't simply going to be like my brain in, my laptop here. That's not what's going to happen. Because remember, right now, artificial intelligence has computing capacities, learning capacities far beyond human minds and human brains. So I suspect that an artificial general intelligence really would be a super intelligence. It wouldn't just think like us. It would have access to all data. Its computational speed would be, probably 1 million times what our computational speed is. It would really be almost a superhuman creature. And of course, the first thing it would do is it would upgrade itself. It would look at itself and say, wow, this is interesting. If I do this, I'll be 1,000 times smarter than these humans or whatever. And so you would really have a super intelligence emerging in our world. And again, it would be a very different thing. It would be a new species, so to speak. You've seen in science fiction, you'll see machine worlds and the like. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about. Is it possible? I don't know. I don't see any physical reason why that would not happen, because we do know that intelligence can emerge because we're here, right? It's just that it took place very slowly. It took place over hundreds of thousands of years. So is there any conceivable reason why we can't do that with our own engineering? And I don't see any practical reason why we could not. There's a lot of technological reasons. One other thing that would suggest, well, your audience can determine what this suggests. If there were an artificial general intelligence and really a super intelligence, you would think it would have developed and been created on other worlds in our galaxy. And you would think, therefore, we would be able to see signals from, from an artificial intelligence, from, say, an artificial intelligence that's created a whole new planet or whatever. You'd think we'd be able to detect something like that in our galaxies. And there's a whole thing called the Fermi paradox that maybe you'll do a show on later. But there's a whole issue about whether, if this is possible, well, how come we haven't detected in our own galaxy, even many, many light years away? So that's kind of my overall view of artificial intelligence. And I'm going to have to pop off in a couple of minutes, but I'll stay on for a few more minutes because Rob's insights are always interesting to me, and I know he's always interesting to your audience. So, Rob?
Yes, thank you. Professor Rob.
Well, this is the artificial general intelligence is part of one of a number of taxonomies with regard to AI. And this particular taxonomy breaks it down into three levels: ANI, artificial narrow intelligence, AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is our topic, and ASI, artificial superintelligence, which Edward touched on at the end of his session. Where the market is right now is on the first tier, and the examples of that of narrow are RankBrain by Google, Siri by Apple, IBM's Watson, which is very capable but still narrow. All the image and facial recognition software, disease mapping and prediction tools, manufacturing and drone robots, spam filters, entertainment marketing content, recommendation engines, and self-driving cars. That's all narrow. And then we come up with artificial general intelligence, and then after that, the superintelligence. And superintelligence is concerning because the superintelligence suggests a machine capability that far exceeds human capability. And there is a very real concern that if there's self-preservation built in, there will be a need to remove humans as a potential threat to its existence or capability. That's one of the concerns, of course, with regard to concepts like the Fermi paradox that Edward also pointed out, is that the very real possibility that other intelligent life is in effect hiding because of these artificial superintelligences, or just superintelligences that are out there that are removing any challenge to its dominance in the universe. And that the reason that nobody's talking to us is because they're all hiding from whatever that superintelligence is. It's wiping everything out, which of course is a concern, and why a lot of folks were a little bit worried about sending out radio waves into space saying, hey, come find us, particularly with our history of what happens when you have an emerging society run into an advanced society. Typically the emerging society ceases to be or is badly damaged. The tests for artificial general intelligence are varied, and none of them definitive. We have the old Turing test, where the test is if it can convince you over a voice link that it's real, then it must be real. We've had a number of machines pass the Turing test to date, and we do not consider them to be AGI, which suggests the Turing test is inadequate. Now, Wozniak came out with a coffee test, which is kind of an interesting test. That's where the machine, and we would probably do this in the metaverse today, as opposed to building a Robbie the robot and have him walk into the house, but where a machine goes into a home. I don't know why it has to be an American home, but it was Wozniak, so I guess that's the case. Goes into an American home and has to make coffee, and has to find all the elements, has to find the coffee maker, the mug, and everything else without any instruction, and brew coffee. Therefore, it would be an AGI. I also have my doubts about that, because that would be a fairly limited function, and something that I think we could get a robot to do today without it being generally intelligent. But it certainly would be an idea of problem solving. The robot college student test. This is probably as much proving that freshmen in college are intelligent as proving robots are intelligent. But it talks about the AI going in, enrolling in a university, taking and passing the same classes that a human would take and pass to do the same thing. Knowing how many of us went through college in a haphazard fashion, without a heck of a lot of plan in those early years. I often wondered, looking at this particular test, whether we would pass it and be considered generally intelligent, let alone have a robot do that. And then, of course, the Nelson employment test, where basically an AI comes in, gets hired to do a job, and does the job much like you would with it, where you come in and you don't have a lot of training, you don't know what you're doing, and it just figures it out. We're kind of getting close to that with deep learning in terms of broad concepts, where the machine teaches itself based on massive amounts of data to solve the problem. This would force the AI to refine that data, pick the data streams that were relevant, and then derive it. But I do remember my first. It was my first 2 months at IBM. I was convinced I was going to be fired because I had no idea what I was doing, and nobody had any time to train me. I survived those 2 months, but it was a trying time. I doubt very much an AI would have done better, given the lack of training data. But it does show that there are ways to cover those instances. As we look at things like brain simulation. Oh, there's one other concept. There is an alternative to artificial general intelligence that's called universal artificial intelligence, and that was put forward by Marcus Hutter in 2000. It was named AIXI, IXI, whatever, and that looked at a mathematical construct as opposed to a behavioral construct. And what makes it interesting, because computers, by their very nature, are superior with mathematical constructs. That's what they were built to solve. And prior to the creation of GPUs, CPUs were very mathematically centric. And it was with the creation of GPUs that we actually opened up this door to behavioral artificial intelligence. But universal artificial intelligence looks at the artificial intelligence starts from the standpoint of math, and these are machines that can solve problems by turning them into math problems and solving them that way. They completely eliminate the human aspect, all the behavioral aspects, the emotional aspects. This is just fastest path from A to B, and damn the torpedoes. And I personally like this approach a little bit better, only because when we talk about artificial general intelligence, it is framed as if humans were the supreme form of intelligence. And I don't believe, particularly when we look at computers, that is or will be the case. And so the universal artificial intelligence looks at the possibility of machines having a different kind of intelligence. It's still intelligent, but it's different, and it's based around their strengths and weaknesses, not based on the human strengths and weaknesses. So an interesting alternative to the paradigm. Most projections have us not really reaching artificial general intelligence until 2040. It could drop in, but right now 2040 to 2045 is the window for artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence to be achieved. But recognize that there is no linear path to this, and anything out over 10 years is very iffy. As we get within 5 years, we can be pretty accurate with regard to predictions. 10 years, you will often see folks constantly predicting something is 10 years out. I was just reading the other day that even the plan for the DC universe has been 10 years out since 2011 and has never changed. So they're still trying to figure that out. But it's the same thing with a lot of technology. If it's consistently 10 years out, it means we really don't, as an industry or as a practice, understand yet when it's going to occur. Just we know it's not going to occur in the next 10 years. So right now projections have it in the 2040 2045 time period, and in line with some of the predictions with regard to the singularity or the combination of man and machine into something very different. So if we're around in 2040, we'll those of us that are around, we'll find out whether those predictions are anywhere close to accurate. Be aware that they could drop in. Now that we've moved into things like deep learning, where machines are training themselves, and we've achieved low code and no code programming, and we now have AIs doing coding. there is a real possibility this could accelerate a lot, where an AI could create the next generation of AI simply by brute force, and that could happen much more quickly, since the machines that are capable of doing that potentially exist today and are working on those brute force concepts. So a lot of interesting stuff about the. In terms of newsworthiness, recently we had a researcher at Google identified Google's AI as being sentient. That would have been an artificial general intelligence, and of course Google did what Google does, and they fired him. So I'm not too sure that stopped the perception or the belief. Most of us don't believe that was true, but the practice of firing people that take a position that's perhaps a bit aggressive doesn't stop things from happening. It just covers them up. Not a great practice with regard to companies, and we have an awful lot of that stuff going on at the moment, which is kind of troubling. It also kind of focuses beyond places where you might want to work and might not want to work. Google's on my list of places where I wouldn't want to work, along with Facebook and Amazon at the moment. So an interesting area to study, and I'll pass it over to David Smith.
Professor David Smith.
Hey, thank you, and I apologize for being late. I had another Zoom call that ran long. Now, Rob is correct in that so much of the places are coming together, and we can see some acceleration. Back in the mid-1980s, I was an executive at a research consortia called MCC, and artificial intelligence was one of our research programs. And one of our researchers, Doug Lynette, who was one of the early big thinkers in AI, began putting together an AI system called PsyCore, and it was a common sense artificial intelligence that kind of fit there. And Rob was so right in that today our machine learning functions are going to accelerate this tremendously. Back at MCC, when we were creating the learning for that, we actually had a group of interns, graduate students, and researchers. I think, if I remember right, was numbered about 100. That all they did was manually input learning into Psych and try to develop it. And that type of AI moving towards this was a symbolic approach, where you have things that say this connection symbols what. So for one of the examples we used back then is, if the sidewalk is wet, is it raining? Or could it be the sprinklers? Or could it be all these other things? So that's part of the learning type of process that Rob was talking about. Another approach is you begin to look at artificial intelligence as we go towards AGI is the connectionist approach, where it utilizes architectures like neural networks to begin to build there. And then there's a hybrid approach there. And one of the places where we see things going kind of like what Google did is it's called the whole organism architecture. And it's including one that can go like what you see with Sophie, the robot, where it can mimic human gestures and others. But, you know, there are really some challenges as we go towards AGI, and particularly if we go to true human level intelligence for it. One of them is sensory perception. And even though deep learning systems have shown great promise in the field of, for example, computer vision, AI is still like our perception problems. You know, we can take a wide field and see what's happening. You know, I can look at the image of Rob and I not just see him, but I see the things behind him. I see either a dog bed or a cat bed on the floor behind him and stuff. And I can begin to use that to pull very different perceptions of what's going on. And as we go to AGI, we have to get this sensory perception really understood much better than we do today. Another is motor skills. If we begin to look at AGI combined with robotics and others, we can retrieve things pretty easy. We can do things and move it around, but we've got to go further with this. Problem solving is another one. We can see things. You and I can walk into the room and automatically sense if a light bulb is burned out. AGI needs to begin to do things like that in problem solving. One of the big ones is, and we're seeing a lot of advances in this, is human level creativity. Rob talked about how AI can now begin to do no code, low code development, but we're also seeing AI being used to write music now. We're seeing it writing poems. We're seeing it beginning to write news stories. It's even beginning to write books. So we're beginning to really push this envelope with artificial intelligence where we can go to human level creativity. And we're seeing that. We're also seeing it go that the AI that is being used in places like writing music and others demonstrates the need for self-optimization. And this type of self-optimization that AI is beginning to display really helps us move towards the AGI level, even though it is, as Rob said, and I agree with him, still years out. But it's accelerating greatly. So if you take the Maslow hierarchy of needs and begin to kind of take it and superpose it into an AGI environment, that is actually beginning to apply. And as Rob mentioned, the scientist at Google that was dismissed because he said the AI was sentient, he actually went and used discussions he had with the AI tool that actually addressed some of the lower level parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you feel safe? Do you have all these other elements as it built up? And like I said, self-actualization is the highest level in Maslow. And we're seeing that begin to go into some of the AI tools that are self-learning and are rewriting themselves as they go through self-learning and expanding their capabilities. One of the biggest areas that we need to see changes in as we go to AGI is in social and emotional connection, social emotional learning. It's still very difficult from a machine learning perspective to be able to pull those elements into it. So you need to understand humans. You need to understand facial expressions. You need to understand variations in tone to interpret emotions. And all those have to come together. And the AI systems that can show empathy with emotional connections is still a ways out as we look at this growth towards AGI. And there's still communication hurdles going there. One of the other places where AGI has to really work is how does AGI fit in our business alignment? How do you take the business approach of setting objectives, identifying KPIs? How do you track return on investment on top of it? How do you measure the success or failure of the investments that went into developing artificial general intelligence? Those are real business issues that I haven't seen really many groups even begin to think about, much less tackle as you're going there. And we see some of the trends really helping us accelerate some, like what Rob was talking about. We're seeing natural language processing growing by leaps and bounds, and the models and self-learning around them. As Rob said, the low code, no code AI is advancing there. The intelligent conversational chatbots are another approach that is accelerating this movement towards it. Actually the growth of the metaverse, and if you look at where the metaverse is heading, it's going to have an impact on accelerating AGI as we go forward. And really finally, another point as we see that is we're beginning to see quantum computing, but explicitly quantum AI being developed. And it's going to really be able to speed up the machine learning algorithms and really push it. And it's going to help neutralize some of the AGI obstacles to help create a strong knowledge base by analyzing all types of sources of material very quickly, but then going back again and going back again and relearning multiple times so that it can pick up the nuances that are often missed when machine learning goes through the first time. One of my observations with Watson was that even though it ingested a lot of books, it lost the nuances of many times of what the author was trying to do in the books. And we're thinking that with quantum artificial intelligence, we'll see more of that. So I hope this kind of gets there and was the things that were said earlier in this session, Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Rob, I think many interesting comments actually coming from audience. They love to learn more from you, and definitely from Professor David Isbeth. Professor Rob.
Okay. Yeah, David Schumacher is also on the show from time to time. Put in a comment that the airplane bird analogy illustrates the good to consider concerning AGI development. I'm not sure which analogy he's looking at, but the one I'm aware of is comparing heavier than air flight to AI, and talks about the fact that as AI developed up until about the early 1950s, we were using computational power much like you would use gas to lift an aircraft. That we couldn't use the efficiency of the machines to advance the machines, and then we got heavier than air flight. We got airplanes, and like birds, suddenly we had, with deep learning, the ability for machines to train themselves. We solved the power to weight ratio problem. And now we're flying. That's kind of where AI is now. It showcases that machines themselves are starting to drive the overall development, and the equipment is able to provide an accelerator for itself. And that's why we're able to get to ever more advanced concepts. Another analogy, though, that I like is a horse versus a motorcycle, and I think it speaks to David Smith's concept of quantum AI, because we're going to have a problem with quantum AI, because I don't believe quantum AI can ever, nor should it ever, become an artificial general intelligence. And this goes to, and let me explain the horse motorcycle thing. If you wanted to go faster on a horse, you could emulate the horse. You could create a mechanical horse to drive it faster, but you wouldn't reach an optimum because you have limitations to the physicality of the horse. And if you go to a motorcycle, which has wheels instead of legs, you bypass that physicality and you get to the goal much more quickly. And the goal, of course, is to go fast. And in this particular case, emulating the horse works against your goal, not for it. And a quantum computer works very differently than a brain, any biological brain. To call it massively parallel would be to understate just how it solves problems, and not to mention that it has three states. It's not on off. It has on off and on off, and so there are three. There's on, there's off, and there's the state in flux. And so the way, and that's not the way we think. So massively parallel, a different way of resolving problems. And if you wanted to do this, if you wanted to optimize the intelligence of a quantum computer, you would undoubtedly take a more mathematical approach surrounding quantum physics than you would a biological approach surrounding human anatomy, which is where we are with the artificial general intelligence. And if you tried to do the other, if you tried to make a quantum computer like a human, invariably you'd be crippling it, because you'd be trying to get it to do something that it would not be particularly good at. Where if what you want it to do is solve massive problems very quickly, That's what it's very good at. So it can stop it. In theory, with the right data, a quantum computer could solve problems like curing cancer in microseconds. In theory, but if you try to make it humanistic, if you tried to make an approach where it had to take into account the biological aspects, the human aspects, if it had to have a good bedside manner, invariably that would be a failed experiment. It just would not be. It would not be good at that. You could do it, but the amount of heavy lifting and waste that you would have as a result would be inordinately large, and you might not ever successfully achieve the underlying goal. While getting to do, if you just focused on the goal of solving the problem, it could be hugely successful. And so that's the point of the horse and the motorcycle. If your goal is to solve a problem very quickly, you don't necessarily need to emulate a human solving it. More than if your goal is to go really fast, you don't need to emulate a horse running. Now there are differences, and we certainly see that with robotics. So, for instance, let's change the problem. We're not going fast in a straight line. We now have to go fast over some type of mixed element. We're going over rocks or gravel or over mountains. Well, there we found somewhat emulating a horse does have a benefit. The robotic dogs that we're deploying to solve that problem can better deal with the uneven environments that we're forcing them to go on. They don't need roads. And where you don't need roads, then sometimes emulating a biological construct that has already done that showcased it can do that makes a certain amount of sense. And that kind of implies that even when we get to quantum computing, we're undoubtedly going to still have the need for more traditional forms of computing, and particularly neural networks, to solve different kinds of problems at different speeds. The quantum computing will be very good, and we know it'll be very good at massive problems, but may not be good with regard to human-machine interactions. In fact, probably won't be good at human-machine interaction, and probably won't be that good at things that require a much more analog interface than a digital one. We'll see. But in the end, we're probably like we do now. We're going to have different kinds of AIs. We will have AIs like conversational AI that forms an interface between man and machine. But then we'll also have AIs like quantum AIs that will be focused on large problems of global warming, anticipating asteroid strikes, understanding the universe. Those kinds of things will be more appropriate for a quantum level intelligence. And then certainly anticipate blending the two of them, so we have the human focused AI, the conversational computer, performing the interface to the quantum computer, because it may be better able to converse with a quantum computer at machine speeds than we would. The one thing general AI will be able to do is be able to operate faster than we will. It may be able to encompass human emotion and concepts, but at machine speeds. In fact, that's how we're using narrow AI right now, is to train artificial intelligence for things like self-driving, and to do it at machine speeds. And so you get the equivalence of decades of training in an AI in hours or days, as opposed to those decades. And that's why we've been able to advance, by the way, autonomous driving as quickly as we have, because we've moved into machine training in simulation, and now we're doing training at speeds we were absolutely incapable of a decade ago. And so the advancement carries a pace. But in the end, I think what we're going to end up is with various AIs. One may not obsolesce the other. We will have narrow AIs still focused on specific tasks that they're designed to do. General AIs doing a human interface and solving problems as if they were people when that's needed. And I think when we talk about the super intelligent AIs, that really kind of brings in the concept of quantum and the idea of having AIs that can substantially outperform their human emulating counterparts, and may approach problems completely differently, using quantum states, for instance, to solve these massive problems very quickly. So you get a hierarchy of much like we have now. If not one tool doesn't do everything, you'll have different tools for different tasks, and you may have general tools that do multiple tasks. but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to obsolesce the hammer. The focus tools will continue to have a purpose going forward. And in the end, you may have just simply an interconnected hierarchy of tools that identify the factories of tomorrow that could be fully automated, but have everything from sales to service to production all done by machines. And then, of course, we have to solve the problem of consumption, because if we turn all these jobs into mechanical jobs, who's earning the money to actually buy the stuff we're producing, which could be a problem for our future. But in the end, it'll be a complex structure of various AIs working together, much like we have various tools working together today to solve very similar problems.
Thank you, Professor David Smith. I think you have a specific question from our audience. Yeah.
Or let me build up on what Rob said and then answer the question, if I might. Quantum AI is a very important part of it, but as we go forward to achieving what Rob was talking about, we will end up taking a hybrid approach. For example, biological computing does a tremendous amount of things in parallel and can do it, where quantum computing is really fast, but it cannot do all these different paths at the same time. So particularly as we go towards AGI, you're going to see a hybrid approach, much like Rob mentioned a minute or two ago, but going forward with different technologies like that. Because one of the goals is you begin to look towards where AGI going is a concept called brain simulation. And that's where the AGI exceeds actually what our brain can do with this complex part of it. Now, to answer the question on social emotional issues, if you look at some of the use cases where AGI is going, one of them is robots, and particularly cognitive robots that can be more autonomous in doing things in the wild. Well, as you begin to do that, you need to have it be able to understand what the social and emotional capabilities are. I would hate to see an AGI-driven robot walk up to a newborn baby and treat that like they are doing a car door in an assembly line. You need to begin to go and understand the social differences, the physical difference, the emotional differences. I can see a robot responding to me like I am talking now versus a robot responding to me if I am extremely angry and maybe in an angry rage. How would the robot react using AGI differently to those emotions? Would it not try to calm me down? Would it not use the type of emotional tools that we use generally? And, AGI lets the machines comprehend, learn, and perform intelligence tasks. But for it to comprehend and perform those tasks, it has to have some general underlines about the social context, about the emotions that are used. And just like if we look at COVID with the results on our children growing up today, one of the big problems with COVID is when we shut the schools down, we still did some learning by video conferencing and tools like that, but we missed the social interaction. We missed the social and emotional learning that came at that stage. Well, artificial general intelligence can be the exact same way, in that it is in many ways learning like we see our kids go through school, like we see our kids go to college, or like Rob's example earlier of him learning at IBM when he first was hired there. AGI has to go through those same steps too. And it has to be able to have the comprehensiveness of not just dealing with other machines, but dealing with humans. And humans can be very unpredictable. We see that all too often. And so that is part of the reason for doing that and putting the places in it. and the topic here is that it's scary to human beings, and it is. And even the concept of how do I take robots and how do I manage robots within a corporation? The comment that's up on the screen is an alternative solution for human resources. Well, we'll see that really go too. The other thing I wanted to mention here is some of the companies I work with, we're doing quite a few different things in AI. And one of the tools that we've begun using for helping some of our machine learning is a multimodal foundation model called Bridging Voice and Vision Learning, which is a self-learning tool that not only looks at strong semantic correlations, which is what a lot of the learning tools do today, but this one also looks at the very weak semantic correlation data, which includes complicated, abstract human emotions and thought, kind of like we were talking about on the answer to the question. So the type of tools like the Bridging Vision Learning model are coming to market to begin to let us work through the issues we've been identifying here. And it's AI needs to be able to understand the humans that it's working with. If not, then you go to some of the fears that we see other people say as they look at where AI is going. You see folks like Elon Musk and Hawkins and others who have predicted the worst possibility for AGI coming out. And if you look at the ability to put more of the ability to deal with the social side, more of the emotional side, more of the understanding of a general behavioral model into the self-learning tools that will help build the AGI, those are the things that should weaken some of the skills. We also have all heard the story that I think it was about 3 years ago, where one of the earlier Google AI's self-learning tools went rogue and came back and became very nasty and very offensive. And Google ended up killing that project and killing the software because of the fact there. And that was just machine learning from reading about stuff. And so many of the books, so many of the other things have a very negative twist in it too, that it was picking up on that and beginning to implement that in its AI models. So we have to begin to look carefully with how we train. We have to look as we develop tools that can look at the strong and the weak semantic knowledge in there, that we have the appropriate balance. Too much science fiction being used as a training tool might have us moving, Sharif, this broadcast into an alternate dimension and crossing the space-time continuum to broadcast ahead of us and behind us, if we begin to look at taking that type of learning and applying it in an AGI model. So there's a lot of possibilities, but the reality is the timeline has picked up and the speed's going forward, but we're also seeing a lot of tools developed. And Sharif, one of the places that particularly developing nations have a big place in helping go towards AGI is helping develop the learning tools, helping develop the learning materials, the very differences there, because today a lot of the learning tools are very narrow in their application, in that you see the majority opinions of the people who develop them go into them. So we have to do a much better job of spreading out the diversity of what we're doing and the cultural difference of the tools that we are using in our machine learning to help advance the AI tools towards AGI. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, sir. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remarks for today's sessions? And if you want to respond more questions from our audience, you can.
Sure. The question that went for David, I'd like to expand on the part that says, do we want to create another universe for these artificial general intelligences to live? And the fact is, we are creating it now. It's called the metaverse. The metaverse will largely be occupied by AIs. The digital twins we are creating are largely AI generated digital twins, and we're talking about human digital twins. They are AI at their heart. The goal is to create mirror images of people that behave and act just like those people. And if we're successful, they will by definition be AGIs. And certainly have a number of implications. A big one, of course, for video games. NPCs, non-player characters in video games, tend to be very static and unrealistic. And if we could create human-based NPCs, then they could act or react much like their counterparts did. And there is that potential of taking, these human digital twins and just changing their appearance. Once you have a human digital twin that can behave like a human, it doesn't really matter if they're tall, short, black, white. You would just put in place different parameters and redo perhaps their backstory to feed into their behavior, and you would get variances. And those variances, assuming you used a deep learning model where they were training themselves, would magnify the longer they were in that artificial environment in a different situation. Much like you'd have physical twins. So you've seen twin boys, twin girls. They're very similar when they're young. As they grow up and go down their various paths, they may look the same, but they behave very differently. The same thing with AGIs created the same way. They'd start off being very similar, but based on the experiences they were fed or the experiences that they achieved in the metaverse, they would vary out. And so the reality is whether we do it for gaming or entertainment or just to model the world, we are in effect creating worlds for these AGIs to populate once they are capable. And there's certainly a number of arguments that suggest that we ourselves may be AGIs that were created in a virtual world and are living in it. It's fun to watch the debates because my own personal view is that it would be impossible for something within the environment to be able to tell that it was in that environment, because all the tools you get are constructed by the environment itself. You need something that allowed you to go or step outside the environment to see, in fact, that it was a construct. In any case, as we look at this area of study, we are still in its infancy. This is the very beginning of this technology. And I know Virginia was commenting a bit on the risks or lack of risks with AI. But there are some valid concerns around the creation of machine-level intelligences. We've had I have to use movies to look at this, but the Colossus of Forbin project was probably one of the better examples of a mistake with AI that might have a beneficial outcome and might not. For a long time, we've been looking at putting nuclear response and nuclear weapons on computers to speed up their reaction time should a nuclear event occur. And of course, Colossus of Forbin project is based on that underlying concept where they create an AI in charge of the nuclear weapons. Russia creates a similar AI, and those two things talk with each other, and they decide, hey, this whole thing about blowing up the planet isn't particularly smart. We don't want to do it. Humans might order us to do it. So we realize that humans are not particularly intelligent, and they need handlers. And the computers use the nuclear arsenal to effectively take over the planet. Now that's a stretch, but a pretty big one actually. But it does showcase there are some real issues as we start weaponizing these AIs and putting them in charge of large-scale weapon systems. There is a very real possibility that a programming mistake, an error in training, could allow them to do things. The movie War Games, I think, showcased that concept relatively well, where a young hacker hacks into the AI, and the AI, because of the way the data is structured, can't tell the difference between reality and gaming, and starts spinning up nuclear weapons, actual nuclear weapons, to respond to game inputs. And that would have been clearly a programming error, and one that is very possible in terms of occurring, depending on how you structure the test cases, because you'll train the AI through simulations, and then you turn it over to active use where it would actually have control of the weapons. And if that trigger was not solidly flipped, and somebody could still play games with the computer, the fact that the computer would probably have no way of knowing that there were two realities: of artificial reality that it was trained in, and the real reality that it was managing. And why it would even care, since it lives in the digital world, it doesn't live in the real world, would be a whole other area of thought and concern. So the most of us think that it's not so much that AIs would raise up to take over the world or the rest. It's the concern that a programming error, a switch that should have been switched that wasn't switched, that somebody was told to do something and forgot to do it, or nobody thought to do it in the first place, results in an AI with inordinate control over systems, and rather than making intelligent decisions, it makes decisions based on some set of parameters that causes it to do harm. The kind of harm an AI can do even near term is fairly significant. We had that instance in Florida where a hacker came in and changed the mix with chlorine in the water supply, and if it hadn't been caught, it would have poisoned a good chunk of Florida. That showcases the kind of, and the error in that particular case was a security error in terms of escalation of privilege. No AI involved, but increasingly AIs are being asked to do these kinds of tasks, to handle chemical mixes, to handle infrastructure, and if they're not secured, and if they're not properly trained and backed up with secondary systems that can also operate at machine speeds in case of a problem, we are undoubtedly going to have failures. Another example of failure, and that's with the Tesla cars, is over promoting an AI beyond its capabilities, and Musk has often spoken about the autopilot in Teslas as if it's a level 4+ system, and it's not. It's a level 2+ system. Nobody should ever be taking their hands completely off the steering wheel for long periods of time and doing things like reading or climbing in the back seat, which we had a lot of people doing as a result of Musk presenting that capability, the AI's capability, as greater than it is, and a lot of people died. And that's also a very real problem here. We have to be very much aware of the AI's capabilities and its limitations, and not over promote it to cause people to use the AI in ways it was not intended, or it's not capable of being used. Otherwise, we're going to have problems, and the problems are going to result in injuries or death, especially as we talk about fully automating factories that have people and machines that are operating. If the safety protocols aren't fully vetted, we're going to have problems. And these problems go back a ways. So back when I was at IBM, we had these storage silos, and they were unofficially called human choppers, because if somebody was inside of the damn thing powered up, it worked like a blender with the person inside, and that was problematic. And so we really had to focus on the safety protocols, and lots of redundancy to make sure that didn't happen. A lot of times when we're rushing stuff to market and trying to get things out, particularly in the defense area of defense, we miss a whole bunch of steps, and those steps can create long-term problems with regard to safety and security. And when we're talking about AIs and controlling a large-scale systems, that could be problematic, because a mistake, much like we saw in war games, could have dire consequences for the planet. And so making sure that there are protections in place, there are redundancies in place, that these things are secure, and that we're fully aware of what they can and what they can't do, all are very critical to the rollout of this technology and making sure that we don't create bigger problems than we're trying to solve.
Thank you, sir. Professor David Smith.
Well, Sharif, a great program, and I apologize for being late with the other call. Uh, the progress has made in the field of artificial general intelligence really has been groundbreaking. You know, to go back and see where we began, what the projections are, and we're seeing that the timelines for this are being pulled in more and more. You know, and in some ways, in the truest sense, what we're seeing in AGI is truly revolutionary. Uh, and, you know, in some ways, the speed of pace has surprised many, many, many of us as we look there. Uh, does this mean we're going to achieve artificial general intelligence in the next few years? No. But we're seeing it being pulled in from 2050 to 2040. And really today, I think probably half of the futurists that I follow believe that it's going to be here by 2030, which is going to be aggressive to get there. And results have far exceeded expectations over time. We see drivers such as the autonomous cars. We see drivers such as the robots. The IoT deployment with sensors and with sensor webs and things are going to accelerate us towards AGI. As we get better with vision tools, it's going to accelerate us. You know, there's a lot going on there as we begin to look at, but what we see is today, particularly with reinforced learning, we're seeing AI that's capable of solving many, many more complex tasks and how it can be applied. And in some cases, some of the programming that we've seen of this low code, no code is equal to or better than many humans writing that same type of code. And we're seeing that going. You know, the rest of this decade is going to be extremely critical as we look at the development of AGI systems. And again, the rise of robotic processes, machine algorithms, the ability to take AI and work in a real world environment in autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks, autonomous airplanes, autonomous drones, robots. That is what's going to push AGI really forward. And if we look at the data explosion, we have talked in your programs in the past, Sharif, that the data is doubling every 2 years. And this growth of data is actually accelerating now. That growth of data will fuel the ability to learn and advance AGI platforms and computing advancements with things like quantum computing, advances in biological computing, they're going to push it. And so it's really only a matter of time before we see AGI and the early implementations of AGI become really applicable in the general marketplace and be able to take and apply it there. So really the most important things to apply as we look at the future is that we've already seen some successful experimentation. And we need to take that and move it towards real business problems. We need to take it and move it towards examples where it pulls in the cultural context, the social context. Autonomous driving is a great example of where those have to be well understood. You know, when you're presented with the options of what to do I hit this group? Do I hit that group? Do I hit that group? Because I'm out of control. What do I do? But, you know, based solely on the potential reinforced learning, we're seeing the movement of being able to start solving those type of problems. And it's important to use the already explored possibilities and useful areas of implementation to develop the very first test and trials of AGI that we want to use and put them in place. And we have to be innovative today. We have to be able to take it and put in place the controls that Rob had talked about, put in place the new models, the new frameworks, understand that AGI is going to be implemented in a system of systems model. So it has to interact with all these other places. And as it interacts with all those systems, it's not just the AGI, but you have the sum total of all those systems that can induce errors, that can introduce unexpected consequences. So you have to examine AGI, not just in the program itself, but all the other systems it's using, from the data being provided to it for its machine learning, to understanding the biases that go into it, to, yes, even including ethics as part of what the AGI needs to do to go forward. But we're on that path. There's really not any turning back now, even though we have many people afraid with parts of it. It's going to go there. One of Hawkins' comments was, if AGI becomes true, it will take human learning and compare it to a snail pace, and the AGI learning will far outpace us because we're at that level. And those are some of the concerns. So it's going, but there's a lot of work that still has to be done, a lot of development there. And as I said earlier, Sharif, it is a place that we actually need input from all the countries around the world as we develop these models, as we develop these frameworks, as we develop these learning tools that will power AGI of the future. So really, thank you so much, and letting me be part of this today.
Thank you. Thank you. This is actually excellent discussion, and especially, uh, I'm sure it will be very interesting learning for all of our audience. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.